Hey guys, welcome back. Biology 181. This is going to be the cellular respiration and fermentation chapter. If you're running in Campbell version 9, 10, maybe even 11, that's chapter 9. If you're not, just whatever you're using, that cellular respiration and fermentation chapter is where you want to be. So here's an overview. Um, all life is work, and work takes energy. So living cells require that energy from outside sources. Some animals are going, like the giant panda we saw in the last slide, are going to get their energy by eating plants. Others are going to feed on organisms that eat plants. But either way, we're going to get energy from an outside source. Energy is going to flow in that ecosystem as sunlight, and it's going to leave as heat. That visual's in your very next slide. And we're kind of putting our cart in front of our horse just a tiny bit, because in a lot of cases, photosynthesis, not a lot, all of the cases that we're going to talk about, that oxygen that we need for cellular respiration is going to come from photosynthesis. So next chapter is photosynthesis. But before we get there, I want to talk about cellular respiration, and that's going to require oxygen that we're going to get from photosynthesis and some organic molecules that ultimately come from photosynthesis as well. Just remember that our chemical energy that we're hunting here is ATP, so adenosine triphosphate, and we're going to use that energy that we're going to get, that ATP, to power work. There's the visual I promised you with the chloroplast up there with its stacks of chlorophylls, right? It's stacks of it's stacks of thylakoids in the grana floating in the syrup that is the stroma, the mitochondria down below. Notice how one feeds the other. So that's what we're talking about this chapter. You've got a whiteboard way back here. Okay, so I'm going to count to 5 and then I'll show you the answers, but try and work these out. So pause the video and try and see if you can remember. These are from a chapter or two ago, so you should still remember this. Okay, there's your answers. What I was really hunting in number 1 was that it's an exergonic reaction. It's true that this is a spontaneous hydrolysis reaction. You can call it exothermic if you wanted to, but really full credit on that question is going to be exergonic. Partial credits are going to be things like spontaneous, hydrolysis. And exothermic's a little bit wimpy in that regard because exothermia is really talking about heat. Phosphorylation is a definition you've seen again and again, and energy coupling came from the energy chapter. All right, so what we're going to jump into first are catabolic pathways. Okay, we're going to catalysis, catabolic pathways. We're going to get energy by breaking down stuff, breaking down organic fuels, and we're going to do it by oxidizing them. So there's several pathways that we're going to go through. We're going to grab some definitions on the next slide, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper. So 3 terms I need you to grab here because you need to understand these to do the next set. Fermentation, aerobic respiration, and anaerobic respiration. Fermentation is a partial breakdown or degradation. So it's a partial degradation of sugars. It happens without oxygen. So fermentation does not require oxygen. And in fact, it doesn't use oxygen to happen. Aerobic respiration is when we consume or break up organic molecules and oxygen and we yield ATP. So a lot of what we talk about in cellular respiration is aerobic respiration, but because there is the first part, glycolysis, that's going to be anaerobic, we don't just refer to it as aerobic respiration. We refer to it as cellular respiration. I'll make that point again in a couple of slides. Anaerobic respiration is very, very, very similar to aerobic respiration. So we're going to break down a molecule and oxygen we're going to break down a molecule and we're going to yield ATP. In this case, we're not going to use oxygen, okay, because it's anaerobic. So aerobic means we're doing something with oxygen. Anaerobic is without. Remember, when you put a or an in front of a word, it means without. Okay, so here's your definition for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is going to include both aerobic and anaerobic respiration, so parts that use oxygen and parts that don't use oxygen. Okay? A lot of textbooks, a lot of instructors, a lot of everybody will just interchange aerobic respiration and cellular respiration. It's not correct. So if you get out there on a placement exam, it will mess you up if you make those two terms mean the same thing, because they really, really don't. Cellular respiration can start with carbohydrates, fats, proteins, even lipids. So we can use those as fuel sources. And any of those can be used as fuel sources. But the way we're going to talk about it in this class initially, just because it's easy for us to track the molecules, is we're going to start with the sugar glucose. So on the left you have C6H12O6. That's glucose. We're going to add in 6 molecules of oxygen. That's your 6CO, that's your 6O2. The arrow is your process or your chemical reaction. What you're going to get out of this reaction is carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So that's the ATP plus a little bit of heat. And that's why I said you could call it exothermic, because you do get a little bit of heat, but you know, I don't know that I would call it exergonic before I would call it exothermic. Okay. All right, so we need to grab something here, because a lot of this, including the electron transport chain that we're going to talk about later, hinges on something called redox, or oxidation reduction reactions. So redox, which is reduction oxidation reactions. What we're talking about here is we're talking about a transfer of electrons. Okay, so we're going to move electrons during this chemical reaction. We're going to release energy that was stored in those organic molecules. Okay, why are we doing this? Well, ultimately we're going to release that energy, and we're going to use that energy to create ATP. We're going to create a different form of energy, a form of energy that cells can use. Okay, so chemical reactions that transfer electrons between reactants is called an oxidation reduction reaction, or we call them just simply redox. Okay? In oxidation, a substance is going to lose electrons. So whichever reactant is losing the electron, it's the one that is oxidized. It gets oxidized. In the reduction portion, whichever reactant gains in electrons, it's considered to be reduced. Okay, it has less of a positive charge, so it's been reduced. Its positive charge has been reduced. Okay, my mnemonic, and there's a ton of them out there. There's one about a lion or a Leo, or I don't remember. The one I learned was oil rig. Oil is oxidation is loss, and then you just have to remember you're talking about electrons, and rig is reduction is gain. Let's put that to use. Okay, so this is your simple sodium chloride. We've done this reaction a bunch of times this semester. Sodium goes from its stable state to a cation. It loses an electron. Okay, so the sodium ion, or the sodium, becomes oxidized and forms a sodium ion, a cation. Chloride, on the other hand, becomes reduced. It's reduced because it gains the electron from the sodium. Notice that we're talking only about the reactants. Okay, we're not talking about products here. Okay, we're talking about what happens to the reactants. Now, this is where it's going to get a tiny bit tricky, and I'm going to try and pull it all together for you. If you are the electron donor, if you gave up an electron, if you got oxidized, you are called the reducing agent. I'm going to say it again. If you're the electron donor, if you're the reactant that gave up an electron and became oxidized, you are called the reducing agent. You got oxidized, but you're called a reducing agent. And then the opposite is true. If you're the electron acceptor, you get an you get an electron, you become reduced, you're called the oxidizing agent. So if you gain an electron and become reduced, you're called the oxidizing agent. Now there's a caveat to all of this, and that's some redox reactions don't actually even transfer electrons. What they do is they rearrange the covalent bonds. So like with methane and oxygen, nobody gains or loses an electron, they just rearrange the covalent bonding. We're not going to do any of those. I'm not going to make you responsible. I just need you to understand that that exists, that this isn't purely a cation-anion situation, that it can happen within covalent bonds, and that it is got to do with how we rearrange those covalent bonds between the atoms. All right, so who's who? See this? Sodium donates an electron. We got oxidized and we became the reducing agent. Chloride received an electron. We got reduced and we are the oxidizing agent. Back up and play that slide again if you need to, but you need to understand who donates an electron, who receives an electron, who was oxidized, who was reduced, who is considered the reducing agent, and who is considered the oxidizing agent. And please remember, we're always talking about the reactants. Okay. Here's another example. I'm going to go back to cellular respiration because that's what we're talking about this chapter. So in cellular respiration, our fuel source, whatever that fuel source is, in this case it's glucose, our glucose becomes oxidized. Okay, so if it becomes oxidized, it donated an electron. It rearranged its bonds so that, right, so it donated the electron or it rearranged its covalent bonds. It becomes oxidized and it is the reducing agent. The oxygen goes to water, okay? It gains the electron, it becomes reduced, and it is the oxidizing agent. Back it up and play it again if you need to. Here's a whiteboard. So look at this. I want you to label who becomes oxidized, who becomes reduced, who's the oxidizing agent, who's the reducing agent, who gained an electron and who lost an electron. I'm going to count 2, 5, 6, 7, somewhere in there, and then I'm going to give you the answers. Okay, so here's your answer. Okay. Okay, so what were we doing? What part of that atom were we just moving around? Who was moving around? Who was getting arranged? How was that working? I'm going to pause again. Remember, it's the electrons. So we're doing the electrons, and that's great, but okay, how? How are we doing that? Right? How is that happening? So that's what we need to talk about. How are we shuffling electrons? So what we're going to talk about here in cellular respiration, we're going to start with that organic molecule. We're going to break it down in a series of steps. And what we're going to do through that series of steps is we're going to shuttle electrons. We're going to move them from one organic compound to another, or we're going to rearrange the bonds in order to make a different compound. Okay. One of the ways that we're going to do that is we're going to do it with a coenzyme called NAD+. NAD+ is an electron acceptor. It'll hang on to electrons temporarily. It doesn't do much other than it's Uber for electrons. It's a temporary transport coenzyme that shuffles electrons from one place to another. Okay. What it does is it functions as an oxidizing agent during cellular respiration, meaning, okay, if I'm an oxidizing agent, I get reduced, which means I gain an electron, right? So NAD+ will gain an electron. It also gains a hydrogen in the process. But what it does is it will shuttle that electron from one part of the cell or one part of a mitochondrion to another. So NAD plus becomes NADH. That's the reduced form of NAD plus, and it's stored energy. It's